Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of In the Chute. I'm Brandon Carpenter, and with me is my esteemed colleague, Kalen, my oldest son. Kalen, what do you got for In the Chute today?
Animal diseases. So something,
yeah, something specific, right?
Nope. So actually, I literally was looking through the queue that we have on our Google Drive, and it said animal diseases, and I know where I was headed with that, but it just kind of made me laugh because I make up some bullet points and it doesn't. Yeah, I have a weird thing going on in my head, people. Animal diseases. We've got stuff. I remember growing up in the early 2000s, we had West Nile. We had a thing called rhino. We do vaccinations for the cattle and the horses. There are so many diseases when it comes to not only destroying their neurological systems, but then also regular stuff that brucellosis, things like that that'll take out the lungs and whatnot. We've got 14 minutes now that I've been rambling for a minute. What are some big ones that we have to deal with? What are some things that people may or may not think about when it comes to producing cattle and diseases? How about horses for for companionship and stuff like that? What do people have to deal with when it comes to diseases for pleasure animals with horses and food animals like beef?
Well, I guess you probably break it down species wise first. I mean, you think about people's dogs and cats.
Yeah.
You know, they vaccinate for them too, as well. So you've got things like feline leukemia that may or may not be able to be treatable or preventable. You're talking distemper in both cats and dogs. And the same thing is in horses. Start with horses. You can vaccinate for a myriad of items. Usually a couple of flu viruses, Eastern, Western, tetanus, rabies. You can vaccinate against that for horses as well. Rhinopneumonitis, or rhino, which you alluded to, which is basically, it's like a herpes virus that is a neurological virus or malady that can cause death. Potomac fever. I mean, you've got a lot of things there that you can vaccinate every year for. West Nile virus is another one that, yeah, in the early 2000s, late 1990s, that was something that was not necessarily here. It was started in the southern areas and was moving forward with birds and mosquitoes feeding, blood out of birds and making their way north. And I remember talking to the one vet and says, geez, do I need to really be worried about this? She goes, next year, maybe, but maybe 2 years. But right now it's pretty safe. I think we're going to be okay this year. I wouldn't worry about it too much. And then not maybe a week or two later, a horse was diagnosed with it just to the south of us. I mean, like 3 miles south of us. And we're like, ooh, crap. It's here. So, you sometimes will run onto stuff that's added to that you didn't know that you had before, or were going to have before. So,
what are some implications? Like, we're talking horses right now. What are some implications for that, for any horse owners or people who are interested in horses? And like, what's the deal?
Well, again, the West Nile is it's a neurological thing that is also transmittable to people. So it wasn't just horses that was affecting. It affects people, and it's a neurological disease. Causes swelling and loss of motivation. You can't necessarily move, should say locomotion or motation instead of motivation, because it will certainly keep your motivation down too. It makes people pretty sick, but you can die from it, and so can the animals. So trying to keep them from getting it in the first place, and then if they do, then the treatment afterwards. But I think, and I had this conversation with somebody early this spring. They were asking about it, and I was like, you know what? We kind of quit doing that specifically for the West Nile vaccine. You can buy it in now your 5 or 6 or 7 ways, which is a myriad. It's a combination shot that you can give to your horses, and they've incorporated that in the last few years, if you wish. some of the areas like where we're at the ranch, we don't have a lot of mosquitoes there, so I'm not overly concerned about it. But even in the areas that are riparian type areas, where the large rivers going through, like the Yellowstone, the Mussel Shell, things like that, where there is a lot of mosquitoes, you really haven't heard a lot about West Nile virus. And so I'm wondering if the animals that have not been vaccinated or were vaccinated at one time and are not as vaccinated now for prevention, have they gotten it and got a natural immunity to it? Don't know, because you really don't hear much about it anymore. I'm sure somebody's going to have an outbreak somewhere. I mean, that's kind of the way those things work, but that's to be seen. So then that your cattle are the same way. We're trying to keep a lot of respiratory disease type prevention on your different types of inoculations that you're using, because some of these cattle they're just not there to be used and be hanging around your pasture. They're going someplace, and they're going someplace where they are going to have exposure to animals from other areas, which you want to maintain that health within somebody who's going to either take them to graze them, feed them up a little bit larger, or going into a feedlot. So you've got things just like blackleg, which is it's a hemolytic, I think, disease. There's a myriad of them that you may or may not get, but if you don't get them, why aren't you getting them? Is it because you're doing a good job of vaccinations or not? And I think for the most part, most people vaccinate. There's very few people that don't. And that doesn't change whether or not the quality of the meat is any different. It just keeps them hopefully safeguarded from getting the disease. For instance, a vaccine for your BRV, bovine respiratory virus, things like that, or BRD, bovine respiratory disease, shipping fever, all of those kinds of things that you may get or could get, but you vaccinate for, does not change the status of the meat from, say, a organic standpoint, where you're not throwing a bunch of antibiotics in the animal. You're just doing preventative health inoculations like you would measles, mumps, rubella, things like that in humans. So it's preventative to keep that food chain safe and prevent loss, really, on our part. Keeps animals healthy, keeps them so that they're able to grow, get fat, and be slaughtered and then be consumed. So there's some things that don't cross over. I've never heard of a horse getting blackleg. Anthrax is something that's really not that preventative that you do anything about, because we've had no anthrax outbreaks for had some probably 15 years ago, not too far south of Billings, and that herd was isolated. But anthrax can lay in the ground as a virus for 40, 50, 100 years, and then for some reason all of a sudden the conditions are right, moisture's right, they breathe in some dirt while they're grazing, and it got some anthrax, and all of a sudden becomes a live virus, responds to it, then you have an outbreak. But that was the first one I'd heard of since ever. That was something that you'd hear of anthrax, and it's a big scare, but really has not been much of an effect. But I don't really hear about that in horses. Not that it couldn't happen, I'm sure, but mostly it's cattle. I don't know what else.
Well, I was
What
also
part I'm
thinking,
missing here.
because the other part of it is the difference in what it does for the animals, in the sense that for horses, if they get diseases and such, you probably have to quarantine them before you travel anywhere, particularly if you travel out of state. But then for cattle, you talked about us, it's mostly for taking care of the cattle, so we don't get lost. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind the consumer, because we do what's called preconditioning, where we provide vaccines to the calves prior to them getting sold. But you have to do that at a certain time, otherwise there's that potential for it going into the food chain, with vaccines and such in their bodies that are still active, and you don't want that necessarily being ingested by people. So it's
Yeah.
important that we also time it. So horses, it's more loosey goosey, but you just have to be aware of what's going on, take actions as necessary. But then for cattle, we have to kind of time it, prep, and get ready prior to sale time and whatnot.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. The horses are usually we give that in early spring,
Yeah.
before any kind of an outbreak of, like, if you're going to use a West Nile virus type thing that's borne by mosquitoes. Of course, you give that immunity ahead of time. When you're branding, we give the series of shots, and then preconditioned anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks before they go to sale. Then we give the booster to precondition, and really that's a preventative again for the next person in the chain of custody of an animal, if you want to call it that. And that's really what it is, because they're going to take them and put them probably on grass, but they want to be healthy about it. They got a lot more animals coming from other areas, so if
Right.
everybody's inoculated, then they're fine, or should be. But um, there are some that you really don't think about, but you have to time absolutely. And that is, if you've got a cull cow, say when we
Mm.
preg test, and you got a cow that would be sold as what's called a weigh up, and she's just going to be sold based on her body weight, and she's going to go to slaughter as probably mostly burger. So you don't want to give her a shot of like a virus shield type shot where she's protected throughout the winter, coming off of grass, and just as a nice preventative to keep any kind of these maladies away. You put that in them, then you got restrictions on that. There's a label, use label on that product, and you don't want that to go into a food chain. So that has to be absolutely controlled much more tightly than the others, because you don't want to send that animal to town with an injection in them. And I did that last year. I messed up on one cow. She was going through the chute, preg tested, and she was not even supposed to be preg tested, and she was just going to go to slaughter. Well, she did have a calf, or she was a fetus in her, and got an injection. It was like, oh crap, too late. So I couldn't take her to town. I mean, that's the right thing to do. So we held on to her and raised another calf out of her one more year, and that was actually that bottled calf we had.
Oh,
That was my fault entirely. I just something that, she was old enough. She raised a great calf, but then this year I had to help supplement her because she was old enough, but I didn't want to send her to town with a fresh vaccine in her. I mean, that's just the right thing to do.
all
So
right.
you got to be careful with that. Got to watch it.
With that, we will take animal diseases and put it out to pasture.